All right, Andrew. I'm gonna tap out for now, but you'll hear from Benny very soon here. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Cool. We ran a couple quick tests on last Sunday night, and so we're feeling good. But if at any point something changes or something's not right, I'm hoping that we'll be able to figure it out quickly. So yeah. Okay. Right on. Well, I'll see you on the other side, I guess. Yeah. Cheers. Oh, I was just saying best of luck. Yeah.
there's anyone that would still like to smudge, there's still an opportunity if anybody has missed on that. You are welcome to come forward at this time for smudging. Well, welcome. So good to see so many of you here this evening. My name is Gladys Bender, and my ancestors were settlers in the Laurel Creek Conservation Area, just a few miles from here. I'm a member of the KWN Area Living Interright Relations Group and the Wilmot Indigenous Relations Interfaith Working Group. Tonight we acknowledge that Knox Waterloo, where we are meeting here, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Attawandan peoples. It is part of the Between the Lakes Treaty since 1783 and the Haldimand Tract Territory since 1784. We gratefully acknowledge the original keepers of this land, and we endeavor to honor the land and its treaties. With humility, we acknowledge that there is much important work to be done through heartfelt action and education. Now this evening, Elder Nina, who works in Wilmot Township and in the area, was going to open the smudging and open with a prayer. However, she has had a lot of activity, and being an elder is a lot of responsibility, and she has responded to many needs in the Indigenous community, and so is ill tonight and is not able to come this evening. So thanks to Benny for being able to offer the smudging for all of you that wanted to participate. But I would like to credit Elder Nina for this evening in the sense that a little while ago she had said, if you were going to read one book to help you understand where we're coming from as Indigenous people, she said, Valley of the Birdtail is that book. And so we went last summer to the forum in Stratford, where our authors that are here tonight were able to give us an introduction to that book. And we just felt like this is something that I think we need to bring to Waterloo Region. And so this is the event that is followed up after that. So I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. And for our facilitator this evening, I have the honor of introducing Benny Skinner. Benny is a two-spirit thinker, educator, and creator, living in the Great Lakes regions of Turtle Island. On their father's side, they come from the community of Harbor Round, Newfoundland, that has mixed Mi'kmaq, Inuit, Celtic, and French ancestry. And on their mother's side, they come from the Kapamkaban people who are ancestrally indigenous to the Southeast Asian archipelago and were stagnated by colonial activity on the island of Luzon, or Philippines. So Bennett works currently as an independent consultant in decolonizing institutional spaces and indigenous research. They are also a sessional lecturer at St. Jerome's University in the Sexualities, Relationships, and Family Studies department. Benny holds a Bachelor of Arts in Peace and Conflict Studies and a Master of Arts in Global Governance, both from University of Waterloo. They are a research fellow at the Balsillie School, just kitty corner from here, of International Affairs, and an ambassador for a number of human rights advocacy organizations, and a queer public figure in Waterloo Region. So thank you, Benny. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the amazing introduction. Is everybody, I'm gonna just do a quick sound check again for folks in the back we're able to hear. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. I do have bios for our wonderful authors today, and I am going to read them. And then I'm hoping to Andrew and Douglas, I'm hoping that I could perhaps sing you one verse of the Mi'kmaq welcome song to welcome you into the space. I brought my shaker with me, and I don't sing in front of people a lot, especially not by myself, but it's important to my people to greet with song, especially when we have such incredible people in the room who are sharing their knowledge with us today. So Amo Benashi Douglas Sanderson is Beaver Clan from Apasquayak Cree First Nation. He is a Fulbright scholar and is a professor at University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Professor Sanderson has served as senior advisor to the Government of Ontario in the offices of the Attorney General and Aboriginal Affairs. Thank you so much for your work. Andrew Stobo Snyderman is a writer, lawyer, and Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He has written for the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and Maclean's. He has also argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and worked for a judge of South Africa's Constitutional Court. So I'll hold for applause, and I'd like to just I'll do one verse of the song. Typically we do a whole bunch, but usually you're singing with other people, not by yourself. So I'll do one, and then we can perhaps greet our guests with a round of applause afterwards. I'll stand up for this one. Hey, Guandore, ah, hey, ah, Guandore. Hey, Guandore, ah, hey, ah, Yankee, oe, Yankee, oe, ah, way, ah, way, ah, Yankee, oe. Very short. Usually that goes on for much longer, but please, can we greet with a round of applause? Thank you. Welalan. Hi, Douglas. Hi, Andrew. How are you both doing tonight?
Doing great.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction.
Thank you so much for receiving it. I'm going to just kick us right off. And one of the most important questions, I think, for the room is, what is Valley of the Birdtail? Tell me about this book.
Sure. Thanks, Benny. Thanks for having us tonight. And Gladys, thanks for all of your hard work, your incredible work in bringing this group together tonight and bringing us all to talk about the book. And thank you to everyone in the audience for coming on out. I know it's a busy time of the year. So what is Valley of the Birdtail about? Well, Stobo and I like to think of it as it's a history of Canada, really. And what we wanted to do was write a history of Canada that is intimate and honest. And the way that we chose to do that, given that Canada's a really big place, and you can tell, a story that big a lot of different ways, but to make it intimate, what we did was we chose to focus in on the lives of just two families. One of the families is Ojibwe, and they're from the Weiwei-Sikapo Indian Reserve. And the other family are Ukrainian immigrants who settled in a little town of Rossburn, Manitoba. And both towns are founded right around the same time, right after Confederation. In following them, those two communities through from the town's founding around Confederation all the way through to the present day, you get a chance to run a kind of experiment. And the experiment goes something like this. What would happen if we had two families in similarly situated communities, right side by side from one another, say separated only by a valley and a river, in this case, the Valley of the Birdtail River? What would happen if, right at the town's foundings, we set rules out? And for one of those families, the rules meant that they would get some support setting up. They'd get access to cheap land. They'd get access to schools that would become progressively better for their children over time. We'd give them access to markets so that they'd be able to move their grain from their family farms into markets abroad. What if we gave them access to credit? And then say, right across the river, what if there was this other family and we did exactly the opposite? What if instead of building them decent schools, we stole their children and sent them to residential schools? What if we denied them access to the market and made it so that they could not sell the grains that they grew? What if we made it so that they were denied access to credit? What if they couldn't get loans? What would happen? Like, what would happen if we ran this experiment, not just once, say we ran it hundreds of times across the country, because the situation of a little town right next door to an Indian reserve is a common trope. My own community, the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, is literally right across the river from the Pas, Manitoba. So this is an experiment that we have run, not just once, not just twice, but hundreds of times. And so what would happen? What would happen if we took these two families and we treated them so differently? If we took two communities and treated them differently, and we did it for a century and a half, what would happen? And the answer to that question is, sadly, the Canada that we see all around us. The staggering inequality between Aboriginal and settler peoples. It's obvious when you step out the door. None of us needs to go far to walk face to face with a staggering inequality. How did that happen? How did it happen? How did we get to this position of massive inequality? Valley of the Birdtail tells us that story. We talk a little bit about policy, we talk about law in the book, but this is a story about families and the effect that government policy has had on families over the past 150 years. And what we see in Valley of the Birdtail is that the position we find ourselves in today, the staggering inequality, is the result of deliberate government choices that have been made by governments both conservative and liberal for the past century and a half. And that if we are to take seriously the idea of equality in the present day, Valley of the Birdtail also takes some time towards the end of the book to start beginning to answer that question. What would it mean for Canadians and Aboriginal people to live together under a condition of equality? What could that possibly begin to look like? We also, as much as this book is about the past, we also want it to be a way of thinking about the future and introducing into the Canadian dialogue again the idea that we might have a better future together, Aboriginal peoples and settler peoples together, which is something that I think in many ways we've lost the capacity to dream about. And so we hope the Valley of the Birdtail provides fodder and food and sustenance to the idea of a shared future and what it might look like if we chose to live together under a condition of equality.
Amazing. Thank you. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add to Douglas's commentary?
I cannot do any better than that.
Fair enough. Speaking of, forward-looking and thinking about that, the future of togetherness, upon reading this book and knowing that it was co-authored by the two of you, I have some methodological questions. I'm really curious. I guess I'll start with, as co-authors, why was it important that there were two of you, and how did that play out?
Yeah, thanks, Douglas. I might start there. So can I just say, hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, Benny, for hosting us. And Gladys, if I was there, I would give you a big hug because truly your organizing is amazing. And I'm sure that many other people helped you. But thank you for bringing us together, as Douglas said. So it's a treat to be here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Okay, so I think, Benny, this really gets to the heart of what this book is really about. And I'm going to be frank with you in saying that this book started when I was Douglas's student, and I was working on this alone and just talking to Douglas about my work. And so my initial view was, I can write this book because I'm a journalist and I'm studying to be a lawyer, and I am really driven to learn. And I know that I'm not Indigenous, but I think I'm able through hard work and empathy to do this to do this story justice. And so I flew out on a one-way ticket to Manitoba, to Ross, and to Wew'suwet'en, having met people over the phone, writing a story for Maclean's about it. And I proceeded to spend years um, going back and forth and back and forth, meeting people and having tea with them and learning about their lives and the people that you meet in the book. And I just want to emphasize for those of you who have opened the book and read the book, these are real people who have chosen to use their real names, having had the choice of being anonymous. And, um, you know, through the process of years and earning their trust, we get this intimate story, which, as Douglas said, was our goal, was to tell a very intimate story. And so people have really opened their worlds up to us. But in the process of kind of learning and beginning this process, at some point, I kind of hit this wall, I think, that maybe many of us non-Indigenous people feel like we hit, where we think, as hard as we try, at some point, it is absolutely foolish to be doing this alone. And if this book is going to be done properly, and it's really about an Indigenous family and a non-Indigenous family, it's going to take a team of people so that we can kind of talk about our blind spots and try to look at the text together. And in our case, it meant me reaching out to Douglas and say, Douglas, I think I can only get it this far. Can we do this together? And then there were a few years more of us working on the book and rewriting the book, literally sentence by sentence in shared documents that he could add to and delete, and I could add to and delete. So it was a process as between us to figure out what we thought was fair and what was true. Um, so, um, I'll just give one example of that. There was this point where, we were talking about the railway being built, and it was in the early draft, quite early in the book. And it said something like, and the government of Canada wanted to build in this area claimed by Indians. That's the kind of thing I would write. And Douglas, he would stop me and say, whoa, 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 whoa. They didn't claim it, they owned it. And then Douglas would rewrite the sentence in a way that was true, but sounded to me a little bit too scary for non-Indigenous readers.
A
And
little
so
bit strident, yeah.
a little bit strident. Yeah. And I was like, Douglas, I don't know who put it this way, but one of us said, we want white readers to get past chapter 1. And so we ended up with something like, these lands that Indigenous nations once governed as their own, which tried to hit this right note. So this whole book is a process of Douglas and I talking and editing as between ourselves to hit, I hope, what is a pretty spot where the words have been kind of carved out so that it feels true to both of us, even though there's one set of words. And whoever is reading this, whether it's an Indigenous person or a non-Indigenous person, that it actually feels, it hits kind of, it sounds like it's right. So that was, that's how and why we came together.
Wonderful. I think I want to note on the methodological piece for the audience, the importance of building the relationship, especially when people, I see this a lot in the university spaces where non-Indigenous folks are interested in it, and it might be for all of the best reasons of wanting to uplift Indigenous voices and community, but in our current research environment, developing those relationships is not always something that they teach at the university level, and sometimes it unfortunately falls to the wayside, and it usually doesn't make for a very good research project in the end. So I really appreciate the fact that collaboration piece, and also Andrew, just your relationship building with the people who are actually, whose stories are being told. I'm wondering, you know, as a writer, I'm actually working with a professor and adopting that similar methodology of the back and forth, the push and pull. And I'm wondering, you know, at the end of it, when you were putting together this final draft, how did you choose what was going into the book, you know, and, you know, how did you shape that narrative? What was your process for that?
So thanks, Benny. That's you know, good luck on your project. That's amazing. So I'll let Stobo talk maybe a little bit about doing some of the research in the communities, because I think that that's where you sort of build up the base stock of information that is going to be distilled to become the book. But I think what's you know, just from a from the authorship point of view, what you get is a whole bunch of persons who all have a story to tell. And what the challenge as authors is to find the persons within those communities whose story can do the work or carry the burden of telling that part of the story. And so, for example, the character of Nelson, who's an older gentleman who has lived his life as he says later as a racist, sitting in the you know in the coffee shop at lunch, telling racist Indian jokes every day. But he grows and changes, and so he's a character who we show how, if a person like Nelson is educated, if he's you know if he learns the facts, if he learns about the lives of his neighbors across the river in Wew'suwikopo, then he can develop empathy for them. That he the way he thinks about that community and its members shifts radically over time. And so, you know, Nelson is a character who shows like growth is possible. I think the biggest challenge in telling the story is, you know, it's part of a broader narrative problem, I think, which is that coming out of the TRC report in 2015, Canadians were suddenly confronted with a history, with a horror history that they just had never imagined was possible. But in fact, it was possible, and residential schools formed the major bulwark of the conversation as between Aboriginal and settler peoples. And after that happened, I think maybe many people, after learning about residential schools, you know, really wanted to get to the conversation about reconciliation. And what we try and show in Valley of the Birdtail is that the residential schools were you know, an extremely significant event in our communities that altered them irrevocably. But that experience in residential schools was not the only wrong, and it's not the only legacy with which our communities are left today, and that we still need to work on finding out how to right. So, which is not to say that residential schools weren't important. And so we needed to tell that story, but we did not want the residential school story to completely overpower or you know, become the focus of those community relations. Because again, while it was important, it was not all that happened. But we tell the residential school story largely through a single character whose name is Linda, who's a single mother who's been through residential schools and had, you know, a really very not good time. And we had access to her testimony in front of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement Tribunal. So we had a kind of catalog of the terribleness that she lived through. But the challenge was to tell that story in a way that was visceral, but compact. And so we land then instead of telling Linda's to trying instead of trying to tell the whole story of residential schools, because we're trying to tell an intimate story. We tell a story of Linda as a little girl, not long after she's been taken to residential schools. And she arrives one morning in the breakfast lineup, and she looks down and realizes that she's not wearing her shoes. So she panics. She decides, trying to figure out whether or not she can make it back to the room and get her shoes before she gets back into the lineup. And one of the staff sees her, one of the sisters, and crosses the hallway and just bang, smacks Linda right across the ear. And she's just a little girl. She doesn't even speak English. She's shocked and suffers deafness in that ear for the rest of her life. And so, in this one little story, we hope to convey like the violence and the suddenness and the permanency of that experience, how the scars of that experience carry forward emotionally for Linda, but also physically. And so, in thinking about who to include as a character in the book, what we're really trying to do is to figure out who among the people that Stowe would talk to, all the hours he'd spent interviewing with them, who which character can do what work in telling this very long story. And so maybe I'll just switch it over to Stowe to let him tell you a little bit about doing that research.
Yeah. Thanks, Douglas. I think what you don't see as a reader is, you know, I think there's 9 main characters in the book, from 2 families and some historical characters, but there's at least 50 people that I talked to. So I think Douglas, I think he did quite a good job of explaining the um, the fact that our duty is to tell a fair um, and compelling story, and you just have to pick the families that can carry that weight. And um, you know, the basic intuition about why you want to pick a few people rather than many is because I think we learn through story. And the more intimate and personal the story is, the more impact it has on us. And Linda's daughter, for example, her name is Maureen. You meet her at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. And Douglas and I could write a sentence, and I'm sure we've all read sentences like, the dropout rate for Indigenous students for high school um, is 50%. That's true in lots of parts of this country. It is an altogether different thing to read a story about Maureen, as you do in the very first chapter of the book, getting on a bus from home and for the first time heading to high school in the neighboring town. And Maureen, looks around her. She's headed into grade 9 and she sees, a whole bunch of grade 9 students, 15, 16, 17 grade 9 students. And as she looks around the bus, she sees, fewer grade 10 students and ever fewer grade 11 students, and maybe one grade 12 student. And she's thinking to herself, something is sickeningly wrong here. And so we try to convey the facts in a much more moving way. If we did our job, then you'll be moved as you kind of encounter this history, as certainly I did as I researched the book. And as Benny was getting at, finding and build these people and building trust is just a years long process. And I can only say the fact that at the very end, when Douglas and I sent drafts of the material to every single of these people who was alive, to a person, they said, you can keep everything. Maybe there's 2 or 3 things you should correct, little facts you got wrong. And here's some more stuff to make the story better. And you can use our real names. And I hope that speaks to the fact that we built the relationships right. And no one in this book is perfect or a saint, as none of us are. And I think I'm just so proud of the fact that we all, came together and everyone wanted to be a part of it.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely a testament to the amount of trust that you both as a team were able to build with these community members. I come from a community too. Majority of my uncles and aunts did not complete high school. And it's a reality that we face. And Douglas, when you were talking about that part in the book, and also in Linda's life with the ear and the shoes, I have a little girl at home who every morning she takes about 20 minutes to put on a pair of socks, and we can't figure out why. But I remember reading that part of the book, and she's who I thought about. And it is to speak to that, the visceral capturing of this narrative is incredible. Narrative is so incredibly important to history. If not, it is, history is made of narrative. And, we really telling our stories is how we capture these things. And so I'm wondering, how important are the historical aspects that are embedded in this book? What's it's so critical in my mind, for seeing this past and how it translates to the present, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
You're just muted, Douglas.
Thank you. So I'm gonna let Stibbo talk a little bit about that. But first, I just want to say, so my sister was in town visiting me. She lives in she lives in a little town north of Winnipeg, about 45 minutes. And so she came to visit for a week. And a couple of days ago, just the morning before she was going home and before I was leaving for Montreal, one of our cousins had received from a friend. A friend had been digging around in the archives and spotted a photo. And the photo is of my mother, or my sister and I's mother, and her twin sister, our aunt, when they're about 4 years old, at residential school. And it was heartbreaking to see. And, I think there's that quote from William Faulkner, where he says, the thing about the past is that it isn't even past. And so all of those traumas remain with us into the present day, waiting to rush up, waiting to just arrive on our doorstep with the glimpse of a photo that was sent to us. I'm sure someone thought, like, hey, it's your parents. Of course you want to see this. Of course you want to see this. But what is it to see, right? Like, what is it to stare into the eyes of that little girl? Who is your mother? Who's just about to begin 12 years of residential school. So, the past, is it past? It doesn't feel that way some days.
Yeah, certainly. I think in regards to time, there's definitely conceptual differences I've noticed, and I'm in Indigenous spaces. We don't talk about time as a linear concept, right? Everything happens in cycles. The past, present, and future are all deeply connected and indistinguishable from one another. So I feel like your commentary really, really speaks to that. Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Andrew, before I,
Well, I just want to thank Douglas and say that his mom was she spent her life in education and was a totally remarkable person, and she raised some remarkable kids. So I was happy to see Douglas's sister this week as well. She's a wonderful person as well. Can I just say one thing about why the historical characters are important?
Yeah.
And I think it's harder to tell a nonfiction story about them because they're not here for us to interview. You know, all you see are these little snippets in what's written, or you can interview people who knew them. But Douglas and I thought it was important to reach back to the beginning of Canada insofar as we could to try to tell this fuller story. You know, and I often hear Douglas say, and I think it's true, that, you know, there are many of us who are quite keen about reconciliation, or you know, or say we are, but we're quite quick to rush past the truth bit. And I think it's worth taking the time to walk through and meet people like Hayter Reed, who I think is, you know, in some ways to me the supervillain of Canadian history. And through Hayter Reed, for example, some of the work he's doing is showing you how we came up with a system of called a pass system, which was a euphemism for imprisoning people on reserves and telling them you cannot leave a reserve unless a federal agent gives you permission to leave a reserve. And then this did things like prevent parents from visiting their children at residential school. It prevented people from going to get jobs or to attend cultural ceremonies down the road or to visit friends. It really cut communities, you know, it cut webs into little pieces of thread. And you meet people like Clifford Sifton, who maybe we'll talk a little bit later, but who's this fascinating, paradoxical figure who, on the one hand, does a remarkable job of welcoming immigrants to Canada, and on the other hand, he's clearing Indigenous people from, you know, Ontario and the prairies, and imprisoning them on reserves and doing all the worst of Canadian history, even as he's doing these amazing things with new immigrants. And so, which is all to say that I think we try, and I think it's part 2 of the book, to kind of give you a sense of the sweep of this, to show you how deep some of these wrongs go. And I just want to close by saying that that is important, but I also think it's easy for those of us in the present to kind of look back at these black and white photographs that sometimes, you know, they sometimes look like these villainous, unimaginable characters. But we also have to bring it all the way up to the present, which Douglas and I try to do, so that it's actually a lot more uncomfortable for people like me, and I'm 41 years old, to start to realize that, oh, my entire life, we've also been doing wrong in related ways. And, you know, specifically, we focus on the book about how we've been treating Indigenous students, but there's many ways. And so I think drawing the history and showing the continuities with the present is important, in part because Douglas and I want to motivate you to get to the end of the book, and that's the moment where we have to imagine how to do it better. And there's this quote that we start the book with by Murray Sinclair, who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who often said, and I heard him every time I saw him present, he would say, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." And so part of the process of going through this history is to be upset. And that is not, I hope, what you get out of this book at the end. That's not where Douglas and I want this process to end, of walking through this history and through the present. It's to get us motivated to dream together about how to make things better.
You mentioned Clifford Sifton, and I know Louis Riel plays a part in this story as well. And I'm wondering, you know, in your opinion, how effectively were you able to tie in these characters? You know, you kind of hinted to some of the challenges, especially when people are no longer around to be interviewed. But I'd love if you could elaborate on the challenges and also the wins that you found in tying these people who existed in real life, tied them in.
Douglas, can I? Yeah, Douglas, I'll just start. Maybe you can talk about a character you'd like, or as you wish. But the thing that upsets me most from readers from this book is if they say, "I found that part with the old historical stuff boring," and that pains me so much, because I have to concede that we have kind of less material to work with, and we're not trying to write a novel, so we don't get to make it up. So I think the narrative still flows, but you don't have the same texture to work with. And so I think deep down as a storyteller, my fear was that part of the book, like, we might lose some people. And I hope if you made it through part two, that you didn't feel that way, or if you did, that you felt that it really picked up afterwards. But that's the danger, is that you don't quite have the material to make the reader feel in the same way. But I have to say, we still found a lot. And I think it's enough to fire up the imagination and to see them also in a very visceral way.
So maybe, yeah, well, I think that maybe I'll just talk for a little bit about Clifford Sifton, because he is well known, and in many ways, I think I had colleagues who came up to me after they read the book, and they're like, my whole life I understood Clifford Sifton was a hero, and I wanted to stop them and say, actually, Clifford Sifton did heroic things. So Clifford Sifton was the Minister of the Interior around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, and he had two jobs. And the first, and this is the part that many people did not know, was that Sifton was in charge of clearing the plains. It was under his government directive that Alexander Morris was sent out to sign what became the numbered treaties with all of the Indians across the prairies to make way for settlement and for the arrival of the railway. And in doing that, Sifton broke up these very large, cohesive communities and created instead a series of very small, tiny, isolated Indian reserves that would be difficult to exercise any kind of power or authority from. It was under his government that they created the pass system and made it so that Indians couldn't leave the reserve, effectively turned all of those reserves into open-air prisons. It was under his government that they introduced some of the most staggeringly aggressive agricultural policies that can be imagined. And so that's a bad man, right? History can judge. Not good. But at the same time, Sifton did this other super amazing thing, for which we should have a kind of pride in Sifton, and that was he worked tirelessly day in and day out for almost 2 decades to populate the prairies that he had just finished clearing. And so he engaged in an effort to identify Ukrainian immigrants in particular, because they had big families, because they were oppressed, because they were used to the cold, because they were good farmers, to bring tens of thousands of Ukrainians at our expense, at his government department's expense. We paid for the transit for these Ukrainian immigrants to come from Europe all the way to Halifax, and then we paid for the train to take them to Winnipeg. We provided the cart, the ox, the sack of sugar, sack of flour, the tent, the pitchfork, everything you sort of needed to get going, and access to 160 acres for $10. And when those Ukrainians got here, they were not welcome. There was incredible racism. They were not considered white people by Canadians of the day. But Sifton, to his credit, did everything he could to protect these Ukrainian immigrants in the earliest years. And we record or we present in Valley of the Birdtail part of a convocation speech that Sifton is giving, where he's encouraging these Ukrainian immigrants to retain their language, to retain their culture, their traditions, their food, their dance, their clothes, to encourage them to become Ukrainian Canadians, right? Like, this is exactly what we want in a person. This is exactly the kind of Canadian that we want at the highest reaches of government. And yet, Sifton, at exactly the same time, is passing laws to deny Indian people access to their culture, to their language. He's making it illegal for them to engage in their traditional practices and dances and ceremonies. And so Sifton is an incredibly complicated character, and telling his story is not easy because on the one hand, we really do want to celebrate that part of Sifton that led to this incredibly important backbone structure of Canadian society. That is the Ukrainian immigrants, backbone element of our society that he brought here, that he built. And at the same time, he is engaging in, what today we'd probably call crimes against humanity, right? So he's a difficult character, and writing about someone like that in a way that's honest is difficult. But I mean, and again, as Stobo says, like, we only have the record to work with, right? So we can't find out like how you felt about that, or did you ever think about that as a paradox? Did you ever, that ever occur to you? And we can't make that up. And so, yeah, I think there are times when the historical narrative just can't be as rich and textured as the present day story can be, because there's just no way to draw out all of those details, even in a life as rich and complex as Sifton's.
Can I just add one thing, Benny? Which is that, you know, I do think these characters intersect these amazing ways that we never could have anticipated. So it was very late in the research, for example, when I saw this little document from Sifton, when he's minister, saying that he, after a fire at an old residential school, approved the reconstruction of this new school, which happened to be the school where Maureen's grandfather would attend. And there are ways in which these characters do touch each other in a way that is totally unexpected and touching and horrifying, I think. And so I hope we've shown a way in which these two families are connected in strange and complicated ways. And the overall effect we want to give is for the reader to leave it thinking, oh, actually, we are connected with our Indigenous neighbors in a way that we couldn't have anticipated. And as it's true for these families, I think it's true for all of us.
Wow, yeah, the complexities involved in all of the interconnectedness is, I can imagine, I commend you on capturing that with such a beautifully written narrative. It's oftentimes very difficult to draw these narratives where you have such complex dualities in some cases, right? And for example, in the case of Mr. Sifton. And so, speaking of duality and connectedness, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. My father is from the island of Newfoundland. Our traditional territory stretches along the East Coast, but oftentimes, we have the Atlantic Ocean there. And if anybody is familiar with Newfoundland culture, it's very strongly connected to Irish culture, which oftentimes people view the Atlantic Ocean as a separator. But for us, it's both a separator and a connector. And so to kind of lead into this next question, for the audience, raise of hands if you had the opportunity to at least read some of the book, if not all of it. I'd love to know. Oh my goodness, that is a lot of hands. Wow. How fabulous. The symbolism of this beautiful valley, I think, is extremely critical to this work, and I would love to know from the authors themselves, what does the symbolism mean to you?
Well, you can't make this story up. I think that's why it's so good. That these communities, from the very beginning, from their very founding of their communities, literally, they're sharing this valley. And the literal border between them is this little river that snakes through this valley. And yet, although they're so close, although they share this space, they don't know each other at all. I think that's true for a lot of us. when it comes to these issues. And it was certainly true for them. And, we start this book with, possibly an apocryphal story about a boy who drowns in this river. And for me at least, it kind of sets this uneasy, um, tragic tone with respect to this river that divides these two communities. And, if it is a beautiful valley if you ever have the chance to see it. And, the coexistence of this beauty and this shared space and this mutual ignorance, and that's ignorance that runs both ways, is a striking combination. And so, for me at least, setting my eyes on this place helped me realize pretty early on that, this place might actually have the power to convey this much broader story of all these other experiments, as Douglas put it early on, um, in a way that will resonate with people. And I just want to add that it was important to Douglas and I that we didn't just tell a story which is very common in Canada of things being crappy 150 years ago as between two neighboring, mutually misunderstanding communities, and still being quite crappy. We wanted to pick a place that, yes, reflected what has gone wrong, but also reflected in more recent times, as you see with these characters in this specific place, some reason for hope to show us that, yes, despite this difficult history, that we can learn about each other and figure out how to work together. And I hope of all those people who just put up their hands, it is true for you that when you finish the story, you felt lifted up, even though there's all this dark stuff, only some of which, we've talked about tonight.
So, Benny, the river is this physical divide between Rossburn and Weway-Seekapo. There's a bridge over it, and it's not unforgeable. So it's not like an impossible impasse between these two communities. And I guess maybe what we discovered in touring the book and talking to a lot of Canadians was to learn about how the river as a barrier is a metaphor that has to do actually with the stories that communities tell themselves. And what I mean by that is to think back again to Sifton's incredible work drawing Ukrainian Canadians in. And as I said, when they arrived, they were the victims of very virulent racism. And they really did arrive with literally nothing. And yes, the Canadian government provided in the early days, the very basics. But these are people who, with those very basics, with that 160 acres of land, with that cart, with those shovels, built a community. For many of them lived for years in literally in dirt homes. And they struggled. And they worked hard for generation after generation, and in doing that, they moved they moved out of their dirt homes. They built themselves better homes. They built themselves still better homes. Their one-room school became a multi-room school, became a modern school. Children, went to elementary school and then high school. Some went to university. They bought their farms. They became integrated into the broader Canadian society and economy. They really, in many ways, lifted themselves up over generations from a state of just desperate poverty. And so what happens, though, with the river, to come back to the river as a metaphor, what happens to those Ukrainians is they tell themselves this incredible story of overcoming. And I'm going to guess that everyone there in the audience today, if you're not a First Nations person, You are an immigrant, or from a family of immigrants, and you and your families tell yourselves the same story, no matter where you're from. You arrived here poor and with nothing, where your ancestors did, but they worked hard, and they saved, and they built, and they showed incredible resilience. And we want to celebrate that in telling that story about the Ukrainians, and I want to celebrate that in all of your families and all of your struggles. What happens though, what the river is, the metaphor, is it's this wall that comes up because when those Ukrainians look across that river, they say to themselves, my family came here with nothing, and we worked hard, and we saved, and they did, and we built it, and they did. What's wrong with them, right? And the answer in their own minds is those Indians are drunk, or they're lazy. Like the river, the metaphor, stops them from seeing the actual history and circumstances of their neighbors. And I think that that idea of this sort of this river through time that somehow blinds generation after generation to the circumstances of Aboriginal peoples who are just literally across the river, but who are both, decades in the past and literally miles and miles and miles away in people's minds. The circumstances of your own family history can unfortunately blind you to the very, very real economic and social impediments that have been put in place in those Aboriginal communities that just aren't seen or understood and don't want to be seen or understood, at least not until recently, by the white communities just on the other side of that river.
Yeah, you mentioned, economic and social impediments. I'm wondering, throughout your process of writing this book, did you did you learn anything new about Canadian history or policies that you hadn't previously known before, anything that shocked you while conducting your research?
Maybe I'll give Douglas a little break in saying, frankly, it was all new to me. And I say that as someone who grew up in Montreal, who grew up in a family that we thought we were pretty thoughtful, and we read the news, and we followed global events. And I remember my dad, telling us about genocides in East Timor and Kosovo and Bosnia. And when Nelson Mandela came out of prison in 1990, that was a topic of conversation when I was a kid. And it literally never would have occurred to me. It did not occur to me that Canada needed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was something that Nelson Mandela was doing and that South Africa needed. And I'm not exaggerating. And I think I say all this because I think it's true for a lot of us. And I think, one of the amazing things about Douglas, or one of the things that something that we share is a gentleness in welcoming people to this conversation and to this work. And so from neither of us, and I think it means more coming from him than me, do you get the sense that we're pointing a finger at someone saying, how could you not know? Shame on you. To the contrary, I think, and I hope this is what the tone of the book is, and part of the reason some of the Ukrainian Canadian characters and how we treat them is important, is we're trying to kind of coax ever more people into being a part of this work. And, I just want to go on a tangent, if you'll allow me, because it seems to be where I'm headed in this comment, which is, as a non-Indigenous person, not knowing much, which was me, getting shocked from all this work. And even if you're in this audience and you've read this book and you're starting to get interested in these things, or, you feel like you want to be involved, I'd like to kind of try to put my finger on something which I myself have often felt and that I often see, which is that non-Indigenous people who are kind of inclined to do more still kind of hang back. And I think it's for understandable reasons, because maybe you're afraid of overstepping or saying the wrong thing. But I often think of a woman who spoke to me in northern Manitoba, and she looked at me and she said, this was an Indigenous educator who looked at me, not an Indigenous person, and said, "We need more allies, not more saviors." So if you're afraid of being, if you'll allow me to put it, a white savior, good. That's not a thing that we need, or that we should aspire to be. But our discomfort in being in this space is not a reason to do nothing or less. And in fact, there's so many of us who are just learning and starting in this work, and we have to be a part of it too. There's some amazing people like Benny, it seems, and Douglas for sure, and perhaps Elder Nina, it sounds like, who are doing a lot of this work. But if you pay attention to your Indigenous friends and colleagues, like, they're tired of doing this work alone often. And I just want to leave you with this thing that Maureen, I think, is communicating at the end of the book. And Maureen is talking, I think she's kind of talking to people like me, or how I was. And she's describing this walk that she and a bunch of families make from the reserve, a long walk towards a residential school that many of their ancestors attended. And it was kind of a commemoration walk. And it's this, they're walking on these old country roads, and there were kids and mothers and grandmothers, and there's lots of laughing and there's lots of crying. But after, many hours, 5 or 6 or 7 hours, Maureen's feet, are throbbing, and she has these horrible blisters, and it's difficult. And at some point she notices, around a bend in the road, these non-Indigenous white farmers who are on the side of the road, who are just there to give snacks and water in support of these people walking. And Maureen even sees an elderly woman crying with empathy, watching this group of people walk on a commemoration walk. And what Maureen thinks to herself is, "Thank you for being here." And she's very moved, but she adds, "Maybe next time you'll walk with me." And I think that is the whole point of maybe being shocked and learning about this history, I hope, which is that you, if you're a non-Indigenous person reading this or in this audience, you get the oomph in you to take some of those steps in your own way. I think that was what I'm going for, and that's what I think all this learning is for.
Open quickly to Douglas, if you have would you like to add anything?
No, I think that's, I can't say it better than that.
Oh, fabulous. I love that.
That doesn't happen very often, so appreciate
Well,
that.
yeah, I guess this time you did it in a way that's, couldn't have been done better, which is great. I just want to double check, Gladys, are we going till 8:15? Is that the timing? Okay. Well, cognizant of the time, it's just past 8, and I was hoping to open up the floor to any audience questions that might be floating around, if that's all right with Douglas and Andrew. Fabulous. Does anyone from the audience want to pose a question? We can run a microphone over to you. Okay, I saw a hand in a lime yellowish shirt in the back. And there is actually like 7 hands that all went up right after that. So perhaps if you have a question, you can also just make your way down to the front and maybe sit in one of the chairs in the front row, and then we can go along if you'd like.
I'm wondering if you have sent this fantastic book to Prime Minister Carney yet. And and if not, maybe many of us here can send a copy to the Prime Minister's office, because I think the end of the book speaks to some fantastic solutions. So my challenge to the group here.
Thank you.
Hi. My question is, I've read most of the book, but I don't exactly remember. How did you pick these two towns?
Yeah.
Did you stumble across them?
Yeah, great question. I think I was getting at the answer earlier, which is, you know, the reason why it had to be these two places in particular, because in many parts of Ontario, you may know that this story replays itself, and the story about schools specifically replays itself with a really good public school, and right across the reserve border, there's a really struggling on-reserve school. What made it, the reason it had to be this place is because things have been getting better. And Douglas and I, wanted to not just convey another story that ends badly, we wanted a story that lifted the reader up. And so that's why it had to be this place.
Is it on? So to your point about walking with and being allies, I agree that the suggestions made at the end of the book were great, but specifically, how can we walk with you, be allies, and help concretize some of the suggestions made?
Yeah, so thanks. That's a great question, and I think maybe maybe what I'll do is I'm going to carve that question off. I'm going to do it sort of right at the end, and so yeah, we'll put aside all the questions about like what can you do, and I'll take them all right. I'll deal with them all right at the end. So let's just move to the next question, and we'll come back to that one.
Are there examples of where settlers and Indigenous peoples have successfully reconciled after having an experience similar to what you've described with the people of Wew'suwet'en?
Yeah, you know, so the particular arrangement that the town of Rossburn and the reserve of Wew'suwet'en have landed on, which is
Douglas, I don't know if you can hear me, but you actually just froze up on our screen here.
I think I'm here. He froze for me as well.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Andrew, you're not frozen though, right?
I'm not frozen. I think I can complete his answer, and I'll be really sad if he can't rejoin, so I'm sure he'll try to rejoin. I think what Douglas was getting at was that the particular arrangement in this, with these communities, I think is quite unique. And sorry, Douglas, I was just getting at your
I just
point.
disappeared. Sorry, I don't know what happened.
No problem. But you know, the bigger thing we're trying to convey is that this is just a way that communities have realized that they have mutual interest in each other's success. And I think this is happening all across the country and in different ways, but it's amazingly rare for people to see that, you know, children not graduating from high school, or, you know, 50% of female incarcerated inmates being Indigenous and so forth is a problem for all of us. You know, it's still this big hurdle. This river that is a barrier it's an amazingly effective deterrent in us actually seeing each other as human beings with equal worth.
Douglas, I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure how satisfactory that was.
Yeah, do you want to pick anything up? It was unfortunate that you froze in the middle of your thought.
Oh yeah, so no, I was I was going to finish very much the way Stobo was. I think like there's a couple places in BC, like in Vancouver and in in the central interior, where I think the municipality and the local First Nation have found all kinds of ways to cooperate with respect to various economic development projects. But around like a shared government service, like a school, I think this is the only one.
Thank you. Is there another audience question? I think we have time for maybe 2 more. We'll see. Unless there's a rant, then maybe only one. But
do you think that your research and your book had an impact on the people in those 2 communities? Have you heard feedback, or I'm sure it sparks a lot of reflection?
Yeah, it's a great question. This was my biggest fear, which is that people in these communities would not like it and it would lead to something bad. I'm very happy to report that, a year after the book was released, someone thought to call up the chief of the community, the reserve, and the mayor of the town, neither of whom were they're both quite prickly characters who are not touchy-feely in any way, who would have said something that they didn't feel. And they both said that this is a book that they recommend and that it's a book that's brought people together. And I think it is fair to say that these 2 communities know each other better than they ever have.
thank you. Okay, we certainly have time for maybe 2 more. We've got a hand at the front here.
And we can't forget Douglas's deferred answer, so
Oh, yeah.
I want to keep time for that. Yeah.
Thank you all for an amazing evening and an incredible book. I'm embarrassed to say that as a native-born Canadian, I knew very little about the residential schools in Canada. I was shocked when I moved to Australia in 1983 and learned about the residential schools there and the horrendous treatment of the Australian Aboriginals. A somewhat similar situation to Canada, but there were very few communities living side by side, as in Rossburn and I'm sorry, I can't say it very well. Wewesikapo. The Aboriginals were taken off their land in Australia, and the families were lied to. The parents were told that we'll be training your children for domestic service, etc., but they were put in horrendous Christian-run missionary schools. In fact, there's even a paint color called Mission Brown. The death rate was very high as well, but I was aware of that starting in 1980s. So I'm grateful that I became aware of that in Australia and that some reparations are being made there in recent years. I'm sad that it's taken so long for Canada to learn about what has actually been a dire history. And even as you've illustrated in your book, with 2 villages living side by side, in Australia, it's a much larger country, and it was much easier for the settlement just around the borders of the ocean edge of the continent. It was much easier for the new settlers to totally ignore the Aboriginals. I'm outlining this to show that there are similarities. Canada, Australia, United States, New Zealand, Mexico, South America, and even with the Europeans taking over, believe it or not, India, China, Indonesia. This is a pattern that's been repeated worldwide. Coming to my question, your focus on Canada has been wonderful. I think you're book is marvelous. I'm hoping you're getting more and more publicity. Question, are you going to take this internationally? It's a problem worldwide with human rights being overrun. Even in Zimbabwe, for example, Chinese mining companies are moving in and completely displacing the locals and desecrating the land. How can we take this Human Rights Foundation, honoring each and every brilliant, amazing, fabulous person, regardless of race, creed, gender, religion, how can we put that into the hearts of humanity?
So thank you for that. I'm gonna take that as being our last question, and I think it's right on point with with the final wrap. And that is, this is part of, I think, a broader series of questions that are really about you as individuals. Like, what can you do? And Stobo and I have written a book, right? And we're both lawyers, and so we are often asked, what is it that we as doctors or lawyers or union members or teachers or mayors or ambulance drivers, like, what can we do? What can I do? How can I advance the cause of reconciliation? And I think that the best way for us to be able to answer that question.
Cliffhanger.
Oh no.
It takes place here, like, on the earth, but it's a very, very long time ago.
Douglas, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we just lost 10 seconds. Can you just go back 15 seconds? What the story's about? Yeah, sorry.
So it's a story that takes place here on the earth, but it takes place a very long time ago. And it's a time when the world, the earth, is filled with life. There are animals and plants, and the oceans are teeming, and there's birds in the sky, and there's insects and frogs, but there's no human beings. And one day, the Creator assembles a council of all of the animals on the prairie. He assembles them all throughout the day, and towards the evening, Creator addresses the assembled animals and says, I want you to know why I've brought you all here today, and that's because I intend to introduce into this place, into this world, a new kind of being, a human being. And the human being is not going to be anything like you animal beings. The human being will be weak, and the human being won't really have any instincts for survival. They'll have to learn all of those things from you, the animals. You will have to teach this being. And in fact, this being will be so weak that you animals will have to sacrifice your flesh for food to feed these beings, and you will have to sacrifice your skin and fur to keep these beings warm. That's how weak they will be. But says Creator, I will introduce into these beings, as I introduce them into the world, a special gift, and that is the knowledge of truth and justice. But a gift that special, you can't just give it to them. They won't appreciate it. They won't even know that they have been bestowed a gift. I need to put it somewhere where they can find it, but they'll have to struggle to find it. And that's why I've assembled you here today, animal beings, to assist me. Where should I put it? And so one by one, the animals, mull, and eventually Buffalo says, Creator, give me the gift, me, and I will run it across the prairies far and wide, and there I will bury the secret. And Creator says, Buffalo, that's a very good idea, but these human beings they'll spread out across the prairies. They'll find the gift in no time. And so, another of the beings will say, perhaps some salmon will say, give the gift to me, and I will take the gift through the rivers into the ocean, across the seas, and onto distant lands, and there I will bury the secret. And Creator says, no, salmon, that is also a great idea, but these beings, they'll spread out across the prairies, but they will also spread across all the many lands of this earth. And there too, they'll find the gift. And so many more hours go by. Eventually, it's Raven's turn, and Raven says, Creator, give the gift to me, and I will take the gift to Sister Moon herself. And there on Sister Moon, I will bury the gift. And Creator says, this is very hard to believe, but they're very creative beings, very inventive. And the moon feels like it's a long ways away, but eventually I'm going to get there too. And so the suggestions continue for many hours, one by one, but they're never quite right, until finally, just before dawn, little mole puts up his hand and says, Creator, Creator, I know. And Creator says, Mole? What do you think? And Mole says, Creator, put the gift inside of them. So that way each of them will have access to the gift of the knowledge of truth and justice, but each of them will have to go on a journey within to find that gift. And that is what the Creator did. And so to the question of what it is you can do in the cause of truth and reconciliation, well, the Creator has placed that answer to that question within each of you, and we invite you to begin your journey. Thank you.
Douglas and Andrew, I'll keep the closing short, but I just, on behalf of everybody who has gathered here today at Knox Presbyterian Church, thank you so much for gracing us with your knowledge and your presence, and obviously your incredible work with this book as well.
Wow. Thank you so much, Benny. What a great job you did of moderating this discussion.
Thank you so much.
And to Douglas and Andrew, you promised that you were going to give us some material to really chew on tonight, and boy, have you done that. Thank you so much. And I want to thank our sponsors for this evening. I want to thank Knox Church here for allowing us to use this space, and to a wonderful tech team that we had at the back there. Joachim, Stephen, and Tristan, thank you so much. Also, the KW Living and Right Relations Group, and especially the Planning Committee. Fiona Lee is here tonight, and Celeste Reinhardt were part of the Planning Committee, and Ron Fleming could not be here. So thank you for your participation in helping make this happen. And also the Wilmot Indigenous Relations Interfaith Working Group. We have all been together to contribute to make this happen. And I especially want to thank all of you who attended this evening, in person and virtually. I think the numbers were close to 70, maybe more. And also to the 250 people that bought this book. Wow. And I think there's more being sold tonight. So this book is in our community. It means lots of people are reading it. And I hope that we can take that knowledge and that truth-telling that you have given us, Andrew and Douglas, out into our homes, into our neighborhoods, and carry on with the truth-telling. There is a donation box at the back, so if anybody feels that they want to leave anything to help us cover our costs, anything beyond that that we would receive will be going to the Willow River Center. And there is some information on the table there about that center too, so that you know what that is going for. So thank you. Go and tell your neighbors about this evening.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend. Take care. Thanks for having us.